I was telling Seppo, people who have joined now, that when you speak on behalf of a continent with the title of this presentation, you got to be careful. So we'll do our best. There's a lot of content we need to get through on this topic, and today for 30 minutes is probably not sufficient. So we'll do our absolute best, but definitely welcome any follow-up dialogue on it.
Yeah, very true.
And my face
So
and name might
slowly I
be here,
see,
but okay, cool. Go ahead.
yeah, see, we're still having a few more people coming in. So I'll start maybe the intro in a minute and then we jump.
Sounds good. I was just going to say my face and name are on the title slide, but there have been many good perspectives that have gone into it. So please view me only as the conduit of the information, not the sole source.
Yeah. Okay, so let me start because we're just a minute in and anyway with an intro. I would like to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to join our session. My name is Tsepo Tobejane. I'm one of the directors at the Lean Institute Africa. Here to introduce our presenter, Ben Hosius. He's also, part of the Lean Institute. So Ben is a Lean coach with the Lean Institute Africa. He is based in Cape Town, which we all know it's often hailed as the most beautiful city in the world. Originally, he's from Kentucky, USA, and he began his career at Toyota Kentucky and has spent the past decade working internationally to support organizations in their continuous improvement journey. With a strong background in operations, supply chain, and finance, Ben gets the most fulfillment in helping companies build systems that prioritize and cultivate people's development. His work reflects a commitment to fostering environments where individuals and teams thrive. Thanks, Ben, for putting together this presentation, and then we look forward to hearing from you. So you can take over now.
Thank you, Seppo. It's a pleasure to work with you both here today and otherwise. We had another session this morning and another representative from Cape Town, actually, as another presenter. So glad to have some presence as part of this great Lean Global Connection. And it really is an honor to speak on this topic. I feel very humbled by it. I obviously grew up in Kentucky in the US and not of African blood per se, but I've spent the last, call it 7, 8 years here and had a presence here and really have a heart for not only the continent, but particularly South Africa. I'll get to some of those specifics here momentarily, where I'm currently based. It is really a beautiful country. It's known as the Rainbow Nation, and you see that in the people, you see that in the livelihood. So hopefully we'll get more of that context to you as well. So it is going to be a rapid fire presentation. I know 30 minutes goes very quickly. I've tried to pack in enough context that you can respect the weightiness of the topic, and then I'll give you hopefully what wraps up into a view of what Lean for Africa can indeed look like. So let's jump in. A brief overview so that you know where we're heading. We'll talk through culture, the economy, and demographic overview a bit. We'll look at the current outlook of the continent and country specific and talk about some of the influences both on the continent and from external. We'll look at South Africa very briefly because I do want to use some airtime for South Africa. I love the country. And then we'll speak again about Lean for Africa. And I think to give you one thing to keep in your mind about Lean for Africa, it needs to be practical. And that's the feedback I've received from many people who have asked questions too about this presentation and gotten their input here locally and otherwise. And we all say everybody agrees with Lean. It's hard not to. It's a nice philosophy. It's about improvement and development and all the rest, but how do you actually make it practical? And when there's so many fires that you need to fight, particularly in this African environment, how can you focus on the things that really move the needle the most using this Lean toolkit? And most importantly, I think the leadership philosophy around people development. All right, so let's hit it rapid fire. If I go too fast, I do apologize, but we can come back and maybe watch a recording. So culturally, let's look at Africa. There are 50 plus countries, about 54 specifically recognized countries on the continent of Africa. You can appreciate each country has its own unique identity, but also within those countries, you've got a mass number of ethnic groups and cultures within those ethnic groups. And you can just imagine the level of different languages that are spoken, norms that are held to, all the rest, artifacts, all the rest. So I think put this in your mind that when we talk about Africa, it is not respectful to say it is one subject. It is really a series of disparate tribes, ethnic groups, cultures, countries that come together to make a really beautiful whole, a beautiful but complex whole. So let's keep that in our mind. And Peter Zeihan, I respect him highly as a geopolitical strategist. He says it well: unique identities, fractured infrastructure, different stories. And that creates some of the beauty that is the African continent. So we all know, I believe, that there was some external presence in Africa back in the day, and largely from European countries, and they weren't stupid. They knew there were some good things going on in Africa. So this hopefully gives you a bit of a lay of the land in terms of the countries that were represented here. The largest ones being France, Great Britain, and there was some influence from Germany and also Belgium, and then Portugal and Italy had some other involvement as well. And that influence really is pervasive even today. There's a large part of that influence, whether culturally or from a cuisine standpoint even, but really from a linguistic level, obviously, languages that are spoken in those regions, but really also culturally as well. And I would say with trade, there are some significant links still with those old colonial countries and the current African counterparts. So keep that in your mind. Thankfully, there's been a swath of independence over the last couple of centuries. So these countries now do stand for themselves for some parts. So just want to be cognizant of where they've come from. Likewise, I think to the point about the Europeans knowing what was happening in Africa, at first they realized, geez, this place is literally a gold mine. There's all kinds of natural resources available on this continent. And really, even today, there's a strong export presence here. Unfortunately, we'll speak about it a little bit on the corruption side, maybe more than a little bit, but there really are some vast quantities of these resources that can lend themselves to a country's development if they're channeled appropriately. A large part down in the southern part of Africa are the minerals, gold, platinum, all the rest precious metals as well. And then up as you get farther, you see some of the different things that are traded. So be aware of that. Keep that in your mind likewise. I do want to also speak to the regional part of Africa. So as it stands today, I think this is a nice picture of how to think about Africa, at least from a very broad level of the regions that are represented. Northern Africa, Egypt and Algeria are the main players there with their GDP there on the right for your reference. In West Africa, it would be Senegal and Nigeria. Senegal has a clear link with France, and given France's rise in the European context, it also needs to be spoken about their relevance there with that connection. Nigeria is a massive powerhouse as well in West Africa, and a very complex powerhouse, but one to be spoken to. And then in East Africa, Ethiopia and Kenya, likewise, those are the strongest countries there. Uganda and Tanzania also do have some presence, but have been challenged by the other difficulties as well that do affect most countries here in Africa. And then in Southern Africa, or sorry, Central Africa, let's say Angola is the leading power there. They have a large oil and petroleum reserve that European countries do tap into, so that gives them a strong economic footprint. And then South Africa there, which is one of the largest economies on the continent, obviously we're near and dear to us, but we'll speak more specifically to that. Okay, and then just for your context as well, and I've done my best to cite some of these references here, but GDP per capita does a decent job at least showing how wealthy, quote unquote, a country is. And so this gives you an idea of where your African countries stand in context to some of the highest ranking globally. You see the US there, 85,000 a year per capita, Luxembourg, 144 in 2024. And then you can see some of the African countries even below 1,000 per capita, or around South Africa, 6K is a decent number. So a massive disparity in terms of the relative wealth of these countries, which I think we're all aware of, but hopefully we can understand a bit as to why. Okay, demographics. This is a very bright light for Africa, and also challenging light, as most of these things are. But African population growth is booming, and it will continue to boom. So as you see there, the call out, 5 of the 8 countries are expected to account for over half of the global population growth in 2050 are in Africa. So to put that simply, the world is growing at this rate, where we were at about 7.3 billion in 2015, up to about 11.2 projected in 21. And then when you see the African percent of that, obviously the increase is almost going up to 40, 50%. So you need to be aware, I guess, of the African presence on our Earth. I was going to say whether we like it or not, but that's the way that the demographics are going. So, okay, all right, let's look at also the youthful shift. And demographics really are a telltale sign of the strength of a country, largely. And you can look at some of the European countries, even in Japan, they're struggling with this. China, likewise, demographics will really define the next 50 to 100 years of these countries' outlook. And in Africa, we have a massive amount of youth, and we need to understand what to do to realize that potential of the youth, I would say, throughout education and other investment in human capital. But it is a large problem for us to solve with how can we put our youth to the best use, as they will represent obviously the future of this economy. So just to put it in one more context there, as I said before, about 40% by 2100 will be African of the world's population. You can see the relative rise, Asia holding decently steady with their growth in the early 2000s, but then Africa is going to have a similar rate of growth over the next, call it 75 years. So something to definitely be aware of, and you can see the percent there that Asia and Africa will be the largest regions population-wise as we move in to the next century. Something to be aware of as well when we speak about Africa is the brain drain, and this is a real thing. You saw that GDP per capita, and Africa is a home to many, many brilliant people and brilliant minds. And unfortunately, when you have brilliant minds and a lack of economic opportunity, it leads to a brain drain. And this is pervasive in South Africa, but obviously other countries as well. And I would say other developing countries. It's kind of the bane of those countries' existence to lose some of their best talent. But this goes to show you that the net inflow to Africa is about 4% in 2020. And then migration within Africa is quite frequent, and it happens country to country, largely based on economic outlook and jobs. And then migrants from Africa, people leaving the continent, obviously you can see the strength there and going up to about 20 million migrants. So it is a problem. And I would say people from South Africa, when they move overseas, the heart doesn't leave you. You love your country where you're born, where you grow up, your culture that you know, but it is challenging when you look at the economic opportunities available at other places and just realizing that reality. So I think a good portion are becoming more optimistic. Hopefully we'll make the move back at some certain point, but just something to be aware of. All right, so let's talk about some outlook and influences of the African continent. This is an interesting study I found from the BBC there, and I asked the youth, 18 to 24-year-olds in each country, is my country heading in the right direction? And you can see two countries there that they sampled said, yes, we're going in the right direction. But then the rest of that sample size, which many of those are part of the largest countries here, economically speaking, said no. And you can see even down in Nigeria, I hate to call it out, but hey, 95% say we're going the wrong way. So hopefully that can be a warning sign to politicians and other economic leaders that there are problems that we need to solve in order to obviously keep the morale of our population such that we can be viable and sustainable from a country level. So much more to be said here, but I do find it interesting just from an overall optimism versus pessimism, glass half full or empty. And you feel it. People are they have so much dissonance that they love their countries again, but we struggle with the realities that we face here day to day. And so I can see why they would answer in that vein. Okay, also important to understand the political environment and some of the complexity there. I think the column I'll call your attention to here is the most recent election, and by no means is this commentary perfect. It's just my view from various press sources. The one I'll speak to mainly is around South Africa. So apartheid ended in 1994, and Nelson Mandela came into power with the African National Congress, ANC, and for the first time in 30 years, that party lost their their political majority, pardon me, I should say, in 2024. And now it's become a coalition government with a representation across different political parties. And there is a high level of optimism, I would argue, in the country now that there are other viewpoints and people are able to productively support. So that's one bright light here. Other countries, you can see that there's election cloudiness and lack of transparency, some opposition wins happening, and rifts obviously between populists and government. So nothing new, I guess, from a global standpoint, but just things to be aware of when you see the headlines, perhaps, of where to trace it back to. The other column, very briefly here, is the corruption index. And I'm taking this from Transparency International, a good ranking system. You can see a lot of these countries are part of the worst side of the transparency and the corruption. And it is a real problem here. And they call it the greased handshake, and it's a real thing with the money flow and the favoritization, preferential treatment. It's a real thing. And obviously we want to reduce that to have an objective, straightforward society to make progress. Something to also keep in our minds, I think you've all probably seen documentaries or movies that speak about all the wars in Africa. And I think Stephen Covey said it well. He said, a man cares more about a boil on his neck than an earthquake in Africa. And I like that quote because it tells a pretty clear story that we all have our problems that are right in front of us, and we cannot care about the problems of the world. It's good to be aware, obviously, but we feel limited in our ability to actually help those problems. I do also feel like as leaders and us being lean thinkers, we need to be aware of what goes on externally from our environment and to know that there is real civil unrest and issues that happen. So keep this in your mind, and you look at some of those call outs around undernourishment or humanitarian need that's going on, or mortality, or all the rest, displacement. There's a lot of wars I haven't even put on here. I'll touch on that briefly. But it's a problematic world, a beautifully problematic world, but I think good for us, obviously, to be aware. Okay, this is a controversial slide potentially, but I think, again, in the vein of being realistic and objective, we do need to be aware of external influences on the African continent. You can see those flags, and I'm not going to say anything good or bad about the countries, but they are present here in this domain. And you can see different levels of involvement. Russia is known for influencing political outcomes and expecting a return for that influence. And they've done that up in this region of Africa here. The Wagner Group, which you've probably heard of in the current European conflict, is highly present here. They've had a very checkered, I guess, campaign on this continent, as you can see some of the headlines there, with local casualties and then likewise locals fighting back and showing resistance. China, they had their vision and do have their vision with the One Belt, One Road, large global trade arrangement. And they came in several years ago within this, I would say, current century, and pumped in a massive amount of investment. And then now have started to recoup that investment, or try to. And the countries have said, well, we don't necessarily use that investment that you tried to give us, and we don't have the infrastructure to support paying you back. So this is a problem. So China is coming up with creative ways to reclaim their investment, all the way to the point of a story that I've heard in South Africa, flying prisoners into mines and flying gold or platinum back. And I use that as anecdotally, but let's be real about what's going on this continent. And then Iran has their own way of influencing here the environment also. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time speaking ill about these countries, but I do want us to be aware that there is a massive amount of influence along with Western influence. And not that I'm not saying is perfectly good in its own right, but it's a conflict of Western influence, European and American largely, versus some of this other influence. And the countries are struggling to understand which to go after. And both have their pros and cons, obviously. Okay, another topic here important for us to be aware of in this context, food security. And Peter Zion, again, I really respect his views. He called it the ultimate country killer. If a country faces famine and the inability to feed its population, it will lead to an almost certain demise. And you can look back at even the Arab Spring in Egypt recently. That was due to an inflation in the cost of food, and people were holding loaves of bread in the street as a result of not being able to afford a basic livelihood and taking care of themselves and their families. And so this map hopefully gives you an idea of the food crisis that is a part of the African reality. More to be said here, but really I strongly suggest you research and understand this, especially as we move into the next changing of the world order, because it will be the defining part of how countries shape themselves around food security and their ability, again, to feed their population. Okay, pardon the blurriness of this, but I do like the image. This was borrowed from a study done on energy investment, and it was obviously looking externally, pumping investment into Africa. And I like it mainly because of the index dimensions. It looks at environmental, social, political, and financial, and it gives you an idea of where there are some real bright spots here. And from that investment suitability standpoint, you can see Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Senegal, Botswana, and Benin up there and call it the top of this certain index, and then down at the lower usual suspects, unfortunately. And I think it's just nice to know that, again, there is some level of optimism when it comes to investment, and hopefully we become more and more higher and higher given the level of resources and the population growth, but also just understanding that you need to look at this in a very balanced scorecard type way when thinking about the African economy. All right, let's touch on South Africa briefly. Not going to spend too much time here, but as I said before, it is called the Rainbow Nation in large part due to its many ethnic groups and languages. Our national anthem is sung in several languages. We have, I believe, 11 or 12 official languages of the country. And it's quite unique when you go into a work environment. I've had the opportunity to work with several organizations here, and you've got pockets of the workforce that speak their different languages, and they come together, they work well together. But just to hear all the different accent, intellect, it's quite fun, or dialect, I should say. So quite unique, and just something again to be aware of, that there is real beauty in the difference of us, of these type of people groups. Also, South Africa, this is my back of the napkin advertisement for tourism to the country. It is a beautiful place. As Seppo mentioned, as I put on there in my intro, Cape Town is, I would say, the most beautiful city in the world. Feel very fortunate to have a presence here. Love this country and this city in particular. Likewise, Durban along the coastline, KwaZulu-Natal is also a presence for economic infrastructure and manufacturing presence there, along with Gauteng, where Johannesburg is. Kruger National Park is just outside, a couple hours away from Johannesburg. So those are the normal hotspots, but you can see we have so many various sectors in this country, and they all are so resilient. If there's one word I'd use to sum up South Africans, it's resilient. They face all the same headwinds we've been speaking about in this presentation, but every day they empower thousands of people in their workforces to really do good work. So again, just appreciate the world that we live in here. All right, so let's get into the meat. And I know we only got 10 minutes left, but I think we've got maybe 2, 3 main slides here. So Lean for Africa, this, after having all this context in our mind, let's now be aware of what we can do. And I like the fishbone. If you know me, you know I try to think of ways to build it into a lot of my thinking pattern. But the fishbone here also applies about if we look at the problem being advancement of the continent of Africa, how do we break that down into some initial categories or pieces of the puzzle? From a material standpoint, I think about this in the vein of logistics and supply chain. If there's one pressing problem I've heard companies have to deal with and try to support companies to do better at, it's how do you handle this volatility of our port operations and our inability to import and export on a consistent basis. You can see there the rankings, the most recent rankings in 23 showed Cape Town Port is the worst in the world. And it hurts me. I'm literally looking at it as we speak here, and it really pains me to know the inefficiency that exists there. There's a lot that could be said on it. It's been nationalized for many years. There's talk about it being privatized, but more to be said, obviously. But the reality is that's a problem that businesses face day to day, where several weeks at a time will pass with ships needing to bypass the port, causing all kinds of working capital constraints, all the rest. Okay, on a positive side, there is a real rise of e-commerce on the African continent. You can see here a study that was done by the U.S. Trade Department of Commerce there, shows a CAGR over the years here now going 40% strong and continuing to grow. So there's a high level of adoption of e-commerce. Amazon just opened their presence here in South Africa, still taking hold a bit. And there are some great local players as well that have been present for many years. So that's something to be aware of. As population growth increases, as GDP per capita increases, or relative wealth of purchasing power of the individuals and the households, obviously e-commerce can come in as a real player. And I've enjoyed working in some of that space as well to help usher that into the next generation. On the machinery side, I think we all are aware in Africa that we could do more in the way of industrialization, and that will require capital investment. I spoke about some of that previously, and you want capital investment that isn't so unfavorable. So we got to find a balance there of bringing it in and obviously having a return. Obviously, with that, we'd like to have more localized manufacturing. That is a country grower. If you can have manufacturing that becomes more and more advanced, goes up the hierarchy there within your local economy. South Africa is a great case study, more to be said, but I speak to that later here on the clusters. Agriculture, we need it food security wise, energy and connectivity, and Wi-Fi is sometimes a challenge. I've been a little bit stressed about today because you never know when it might cut out. So, but it is a reality. I think for the most part it works, but there are those times when it does not. And also energy, we do have something called load shedding here in South Africa, which thankfully has alleviated recently. But time and time again, the grid will indeed fail, and we'll need ways to remediate that, along with other basic infrastructure. Near and dear to my heart, as you heard briefly in the intro there, is education. Education, Mandela said, is the most powerful weapon or tool, sorry, we can use to change the world. And I truly believe it. And it inspires me every day, the ability to work in this education space, along with social justice, protection of our youth, helping them develop the right type of thinking. And I would say principled leadership. Can I look up to people that are planting the right seeds that one day we'll be able to harvest? And that's in terms of what we're investing into them. An initiative I'm very pleased to be part of in some small way is called FAME. It's a Federation of Advanced Manufacturing Education. It was born out of the US. Dennis Parker there in the middle, a Toyota veteran, has worked there many years, and now it's with the Manufacturing Institute as the leader of the organization. for fame. We had the opportunity back in May of this year to go tour the Toyota headquarters in North America, and we had some other representation from Toyota South Africa and another large South African employer here, the largest in the country. And there is a chapter, hopefully soon to be started, here in KwaZulu-Natal, where Toyota has a presence. So very exciting on that, and I hope that will, and I'll be working towards that continuing to grow, because I see it as a real investment in the future. Likewise, on the method, how do we work together well? Improve the work methods. I love the applicability of TWI, training within industry here in the local context, training a workforce, developing them, helping to engage them as well and relate to them. And then also we have a great group, a group I was able to work with last year, BMA, Benchmarking Manufacturing. They brought together industry clusters, large numbers of employers across various sectors, clothing and textiles, automotive, chemicals, that share best practices and come up with ways to innovate. And then likewise, we have a great local group in Cape Town that's a couple hundred strong, where we do site visits and we do monthly get-togethers and speak about issues that business leaders are facing. So I just find that level of engagement and collaboration is very powerful when you get to understand where people are coming from. All right, we're short on time, so let me hit this very briefly. I've had this slide for a couple of years and always wondered about the way to take it forward. It maybe helps me map my involvement in this ecosystem, where we know we have various players: government, education, civil society, business within that. And you can see, if you got some time, read through maybe the bullet points there as we're speaking. And we argue, like, what can bring these people together? And in the past, I've had the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I know there's some controversy on those and whatever. Nothing's perfect. I guess my perfect alignment is, can we have a win-win? Can we have high consideration, high courage, where people are willing to put their own interest aside for just a moment to understand the interest of the other stakeholders that are involved in solving these types of problems? And if we have more win-win, I think we'll have a better off economy, society, community. And that's what drives me. It's never perfect and never easy, but it's at least my personal mandate that thankfully a lot of people also ascribe to here locally. One thing as well, when you think about Africa, you cannot deny the role of Maslow's hierarchy, probably the oldest business management framework that we're all aware of, but it really is a real thing. And if you go into an environment and you start using lean to say, hey, let's contribute to society, contribute to the world, self-actualization, they look at you and say, of course, we want to do that, but I'm struggling to put food on the table for my family. I don't have a place to live. So I think that's where, again, lean needs to be practical. You have to meet people where they are. You have to meet a company where they are when it comes to lean application, and being able to get out of business survival mode, being able to work your way up the hierarchy of needs in terms of how you apply lean in that context. And finally, let's sum it up here with this final slide here. Some key themes, and then these include some quotes that I've been thankful to collect from local business leaders and people I respect. And you can see it. We all agree the lean philosophy applies, even more in the vein of people development here in Africa. The one I like here is that improvements to save time, cool, but I need to save money. I need to use lean to save money to become more viable, to survive as a company. That's great. That's where lean can be useful. And again, lean cannot rely just on its theory. We have to actually use it to solve a problem, and it requires the hard work that we need to do to put it into practice. The other side, interesting, is that we felt there's a bit of isolation that happens in Africa, and especially South Africa and apartheid. There was a real isolation that was occurring in terms of media and external influence. And so for so long, people very sharp here, as I said, some of the most resilient globally, they had to figure out how to make things work. And a lot of them used lean principles, whether they call it that or not. But now having lean as a lexicon and something to reference obviously helped clarify that. So a couple others there, but we don't have the time to get all of them. So key solutions: how do we use lean to create more jobs? And this is a back and forth issue, because I know we're getting into the world of automation and AI, and how do we reduce the number of jobs? And this is that push-pull. We got a high level of population growth. How do we put them to productive use? Because if people are productively utilized and have their skills going, less crime, less all the rest. So let's be aware of how do we use all the new innovation to create jobs and put people in those positions. Education, can't say enough about it. And thank you to everybody out there that is working in this space. Let's keep doing more and more around that. And if you'd like to build a bridge to South Africa, please let me know, or the continent. I'll do my best to support there, but always open to those ideas. Anti-corruption, we need it. We need more black and white, clear rules on corruption and its presence here. And it is poisonous to progress. So let's be aware of that role. And then inefficiency. That's our charge as citizens and members of the community. How can we do our best and inform where there are ways that we can make living easier, doing business easier, getting along easier, all the rest. So hopefully that caps it off. Man, that was a lot. We're right on time there. But again, I welcome your questions after today. Hopefully, it's just a taste of some of the complexity and the beauty that is lean in Africa. And I'm very privileged to be here and being some small part of it again. And thank you for tuning in.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, like this was quite a lot there. I don't see questions, but maybe a quick one. Because we've seen that there is really a need for lean on the continent. What is, from your experience, the biggest uh, challenge that is preventing for lean adoption to your knowledge?
Fear, fear of other things. And I would say most of the business leaders I interact with, again, they will not disagree with you to say, of course, lean is good, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of having to close down the business. I'm afraid of my workforce not showing up. I'm afraid of whatever other macroeconomic shift that will occur that will cause my livelihood to be in at jeopardy. And that fear is real. So I think helping people understand that lean is also a way we can work through some of that fear, thankfully, and but also not giving lean an overweight view of its suitability for a business. It's like it is the way we can think, and I would say it's a pervasive philosophy. Let's adopt that in the way we go about solving our business challenges. But we can't just say if you do lean, all your problems are going to go away. I wish it was that easy. So
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Because I think you really have it is when if they can grasp that with lean, it's another way of being able to see and work through the challenges and problems. So I think that also shows the amount of work we still need to do as the Lean Institute.
agreed, agreed. Keeps it fun.
Awesome. I see some, how can Lean help people to reduce corruption and division
Mm.
in African societies?
Yeah, good point. So for me, lean, there's an image on some other slides there, but the concept of long-term mutual prosperity, and that is Toyota's guiding light, and it's how do we create value, not only for our company and for our internal stakeholders, our employees, but likewise for our business partners, our suppliers, obviously customers part of that, but likewise, how do we contribute broader to society and the communities that we're part of? And that mindset is what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's not just driving cost improvement for your business or your own operation. It's saying, how can we contribute to something beyond ourselves? And I think if lean thinking had that same mindset with the corruption vein of, listen, if I'm pulling money out today, I'm poisoning tomorrow. And if you think today for tomorrow and you think principles and you think, what can I do today that's going to improve tomorrow? You're not going to be poisonous and start just pilfering where you see the opportunity to. So if we had more mindset like that, I think it would definitely help.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It's because we're speaking about systems thinking, exactly that,
Mm.
and thinking long term. That I think there's the concept of eating the seeds instead of planting.
Indeed. Indeed.
I think in the interest of time, we don't want to take away the people's time to join other sessions. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to everyone who joined us. This was a big topic, but I think you've done with the time given, you've done a lot of justice. Thanks again, and thanks everyone for
Thank you,
joining
Stefan.
us. Please let's go and join the other sessions.
Thanks all. Talk to you soon.
Awesome.